Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history, where love transforms into something unrecognizable, and death becomes merely the beginning of a far more disturbing story. Before we descend into the shadows of St. Augustine Parish, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you alone in your room at midnight, or perhaps listening during a quiet afternoon? Your presence here matters to our community, and I genuinely want to know who walks this dark path with us today. Now let me take you back to Louisiana in the year 1893. The state was still recovering from the wounds of Reconstruction, its economy struggling, its people divided between old Southern traditions and an uncertain modern future. In the rural parishes far from New Orleans, life moved slowly, governed by the rhythms of agriculture, the strictures of the church, and an unspoken understanding that some things were better left unexamined. St. Augustine Parish was one such place, a small community of perhaps 300 souls clustered around a white wooden church, a general store, and a cemetery that had served the faithful for nearly 70 years. The cemetery sat on a slight elevation, unusual for Louisiana's flat terrain, surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Beyond the cemetery's rusted iron fence stretched the vast cypress swamps, where water and land became indistinguishable, and where locals whispered that the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. In March of that year, yellow fever swept through the parish with devastating speed. Within 2 weeks, 17 people had died, their bodies hastily buried to prevent further contagion. Among the dead was Eleanor Whitmore, 19 years old, daughter of Marcus Whitmore, a prosperous merchant who had moved his family from New Orleans 5 years earlier, seeking refuge from the city's corruption and disease. The irony of Eleanor's death was not lost on the community. Eleanor was buried on March 23, 1893, in a plot her father had purchased in the cemetery's newer section beneath a young magnolia tree. Father Benedict Rouge performed the service. 43 mourners attended, despite the fear of infection. By all accounts, it was a proper Christian burial, dignified and solemn. But something happened that day that no one could have anticipated, something that would transform St. Augustine Parish from a forgettable footnote in Louisiana history into the site of one of the most disturbing cases ever whispered about in the American South. The cemetery's gravedigger, a man named Thomas Crane, was present at the burial, as was his duty. He stood at a respectful distance, cap in hand, waiting to complete his work once the mourners departed. Several witnesses would later recall that Thomas watched the ceremony with unusual intensity, his eyes never leaving the coffin as it was lowered into the earth. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that Thomas Crane had already decided something that morning, something that would make him infamous, something that would haunt the parish for generations to come. Within 6 weeks of Eleanor Whitmore's burial, rumors began to circulate through St. Augustine Parish. Disturbing rumors, impossible rumors, rumors that would eventually force the community to confront a horror so profound that many would later claim it had been exaggerated, that it couldn't possibly have happened the way people said it did. But the official records tell a different story. The testimony of witnesses, the reports filed with the parish authorities, the desperate letters sent to the Louisiana State Police, the newspaper accounts that were quickly suppressed, they all confirm the same terrible truth. Something unspeakable was happening in the St. Augustine Parish Cemetery, and at the center of it all was Thomas Crane, the gravedigger, and his obsession with a dead girl named Eleanor Whitmore. This is the story of what happened in those dark months of 1893. This is the story of a love that should never have existed, a love that violated every law of God and man, a love that was quite literally buried alive. To understand what happened in St. Augustine Parish, we must first understand the world that created Thomas Crane and the circumstances that would allow his actions to continue undetected for as long as they did. Louisiana in 1893 existed in a state of profound transition and trauma. The Civil War had ended less than 30 years earlier, but its effects still dominated every aspect of Southern life. Reconstruction had officially concluded in 1877, but the chaos it left behind, the economic devastation, the social upheaval, the collapse of the old plantation system, these wounds remained raw and unhealed. St. Augustine Parish exemplified this struggle. Founded in 1821 by French Catholic settlers, it had once been a prosperous community built on sugarcane cultivation, but the war had destroyed its economy. By the 1890s, most residents survived through subsistence farming, occasional trade with New Orleans, and an increasingly desperate attempt to maintain the appearances of their former gentility. The parish was isolated, accessible only by a single unpaved road that became impassable during the frequent rains. This isolation bred insularity. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets were difficult to keep, but when kept, they were kept absolutely protected by the community's collective desire to maintain respectability and avoid scandal. The Catholic Church dominated social life. Father Benedict Rouge had served as parish priest for 18 years. He was a stern man, educated in France, who believed deeply in sin, redemption, and the eternal battle between good and evil. His sermons frequently addressed the dangers of moral corruption, the necessity of vigilance against Satan's temptations, and the importance of maintaining proper Christian conduct even in difficult times. Death was an omnipresent reality in 19th century Louisiana. Yellow fever epidemics struck regularly. Malaria was endemic. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Accidents, infections, complications from childbirth, these claimed lives with brutal regularity. The people of St. Augustine Parish lived in constant proximity to death, and this familiarity bred elaborate rituals and superstitions. Victorian mourning customs were strictly observed. Widows wore black for at least a year. Mirrors were covered when someone died. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. The dead were waked in their homes, laid out in the parlor for viewing. Photography of the deceased was common, sometimes the only photograph a poor family would ever possess. The cemetery itself was a sacred space, meticulously maintained despite the community's poverty. Families took pride in their plots. Fresh flowers were placed regularly. Monuments were cleaned. To disturb a grave was considered not just criminal but sacrilegious, an offense against God himself. Into this world, Thomas Crane had arrived 7 years earlier, in 1886. He came from Virginia, though he spoke little of his past. He was a large man, powerfully built from years of physical labor, with dark hair and darker eyes that rarely met anyone's gaze directly. He was perhaps 30 when he arrived, though he looked older, weathered by hardship. Father Rouge had hired him as the cemetery's caretaker and gravedigger after the previous man died of consumption. Thomas proved reliable and hard-working. He lived alone in a small cottage at the cemetery's edge, a structure that had housed gravediggers for decades. He kept to himself, spoke only when necessary, attended Sunday Mass, but sat alone in the back pew. The community regarded him with the casual distance reserved for those who work with the dead. Grave digging was necessary work, but it marked a man as separate, contaminated by his constant proximity to corpses. Children were warned not to bother him. Women avoided speaking to him directly. Men acknowledged him with curt nods, but rarely engaged in conversation. Thomas seemed content with this isolation, or at least accepting of it. He performed his duties without complaint. He dug graves, maintained the grounds, rang the church bells for funerals. He was punctual, thorough, and seemingly without ambition for anything beyond his narrow role. But there were small oddities that some noticed, details that would later seem significant. Thomas kept his cottage obsessively clean, unusual for a bachelor living alone. He grew flowers in a small garden behind his home, roses and magnolias carefully tended. He was sometimes seen sitting on his porch in the evenings, reading by lamplight, which suggested an education unusual for a man of his station. And he was observed on multiple occasions, lingering at graves long after his work was complete, standing silent and still, as if in meditation or prayer. At the time, this seemed merely eccentric, perhaps even touching evidence of a spiritual nature. Later, it would be interpreted very differently. Eleanor Whitmore's family was among the parish's elite, though their elite status was relative in such a poor community. Her father, Marcus, operated the general store and served as an informal banker, extending credit to farmers and collecting debts with firm but fair consistency. Her mother, Catherine, had died 3 years earlier from complications following a miscarriage, leaving Marcus to raise Eleanor and her younger brother, Daniel, then 16. Eleanor was remembered as beautiful, gracious, and devout. She taught Sunday school to the younger children. She played piano at church services. She helped her father with the store's accounts, demonstrating an unusual aptitude for figures. Several young men in the parish had expressed interest in courting her, but her father had been protective, believing she was still too young for marriage. When Eleanor contracted yellow fever in early March 1893, the community rallied. Women brought food. The parish doctor, an elderly man named Thaddeus Marsh, visited daily. Father Rouge came to pray at her bedside, but the disease progressed rapidly. On March 21st, Eleanor became delirious. On March 22nd, she slipped into unconsciousness. On the morning of March 23rd, she died. Her father and brother at her bedside. Her death devastated Marcus Whitmore. Neighbors reported hearing him weeping through the walls of his home. At the funeral, he had to be physically supported by his son and Father Rouge. He purchased the finest coffin available, had Eleanor dressed in a white gown that had belonged to her mother, and arranged for the most elaborate headstone the parish had ever seen, ordered from a stonecutter in New Orleans. Thomas Crane dug Eleanor's grave himself, as was his duty. It was located in the cemetery's eastern section, beneath the young magnolia tree, a plot that received morning sunlight and had a clear view of the church spire. What Thomas thought or felt as he prepared that grave, we can only imagine. But what he did in the weeks that followed would reveal thoughts and feelings so twisted, so incomprehensible to normal human understanding, that they would become the stuff of nightmares. The first indication that something was wrong came exactly 2 weeks after Eleanor's burial on April 6, 1893. Martha Devereux, a widow in her 60s who visited her late husband's grave every Thursday afternoon, arrived at the cemetery around 3 o'clock. She later testified that she immediately noticed something disturbing about Eleanor Whitmore's grave. The earth appeared freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging. The flowers that had been placed there just days before were scattered and crushed. Most disturbingly, there appeared to be footprints in the soft earth around the grave, deep impressions suggesting someone had stood there for an extended period. Martha mentioned this to Father Rouge after evening mass that Sunday. The priest was concerned but not yet alarmed. It was not unheard of for animals to disturb graves or for the earth to settle unevenly after burial. He made a note to speak with Thomas Crane about properly maintaining the Whitmore plot. But when Father Rouge visited the cemetery the following Monday, he discovered something that transformed his concern into genuine alarm. Eleanor's grave had been disturbed again, more extensively this time. The earth was even more visibly disrupted, and there, pressed into the soft ground near the headstone, was a perfect handprint, unmistakably human, unmistakably deliberate. Father Rouge immediately sought out Thomas Crane. He found the gravedigger working in the cemetery's northern section, repairing a collapsed section of the iron fence. When questioned about Eleanor's grave, Thomas claimed ignorance. He had noticed the disturbance, he said, but assumed it was caused by wild dogs or perhaps vandals. He had planned to repair it that very afternoon. The priest accepted this explanation, but instructed Thomas to be more vigilant. He also decided to mention the situation to Marcus Whitmore, believing the grieving father had a right to know his daughter's resting place had been disturbed. Marcus's reaction was immediate and intense. He arrived at the cemetery within an hour, accompanied by his son Daniel and 2 other men from the parish. They examined Eleanor's grave thoroughly. Marcus was distraught, demanding to know who would desecrate his daughter's final resting place. Father Rouge attempted to calm him, suggesting again that animals were the likely culprits. But Daniel Whitmore, a quiet young man who rarely spoke in public, made an observation that would prove significant. He pointed out that the disturbance seemed to follow a pattern, concentrated at the grave's head, where Eleanor's face would be positioned beneath the earth. If animals had been responsible, he argued, the damage would be more random, more chaotic. This looked deliberate. This looked like someone digging with purpose. The men dismissed Daniel's observation as the paranoid imagination of a grieving brother. They helped Thomas refill and smooth the disturbed earth, replanted the flowers, and departed, warning Thomas to keep better watch over the cemetery. Thomas assured them he would. He promised to patrol the grounds more frequently, especially at night. He expressed appropriate outrage at the violation and appropriate sympathy for the Whitmore family's distress. But 3 days later, on April 12th, Eleanor's grave was disturbed again. This time it was discovered by James Callahan, a farmer who had come to the cemetery early in the morning to visit his infant daughter's grave. He found Eleanor's plot in severe disarray. The flowers were not just scattered, but deliberately arranged in a circular pattern around the grave. The earth was deeply excavated in multiple places, as if someone had been systematically probing the ground. And most disturbing of all, pressed into the soil near the headstone, there was now a collection of small objects, a ribbon, several buttons, and what appeared to be a woman's hair comb. James immediately reported this to Father Rouge, who in turn summoned Marcus Whitmore and contacted the parish constable, a man named Robert Thatcher. Constable Thatcher was in his 50s, a former Confederate soldier who had served as the parish's law enforcement for over a decade. He arrived at the cemetery by mid-morning and began what would become an official investigation. Thatcher examined the gravesite carefully. He collected the objects found there. He measured the footprints, noting they appeared to belong to a large man, probably someone who worked with his hands based on the depth of impression. He interviewed Thomas Crane at length. Thomas maintained his innocence. He seemed genuinely bewildered and upset by the continued disturbances. He offered no explanation for the objects found at the grave, suggesting they might have been left by mourners and then scattered by whatever animal or person was disturbing the site. He reiterated his commitment to protecting the cemetery and suggested he might begin sleeping with his door open so he could hear any nighttime intrusions. Constable Thatcher was not entirely convinced, but he had no evidence to support any accusation. He posted a notice in the general store warning that grave desecration was a serious crime and that anyone caught disturbing the cemetery would face prosecution. He also arranged for several men to take turns watching the cemetery at night, hoping to catch the perpetrator in the act. For 2 weeks, the night watches continued. Nothing unusual was observed. Eleanor's grave remained undisturbed. The community began to relax, believing that the publicity and the watches had scared off whoever was responsible. Then, on the night of April 28th, something happened that would change everything. Samuel Peters, a young farmer who had volunteered for the night watch, was stationed in the cemetery from midnight until dawn. He positioned himself behind a large mausoleum that provided a clear view of Eleanor's grave while keeping him concealed. The night was humid and moonless, typical for Louisiana. In late April, Samuel later testified that he had begun to doze around 3 in the morning when he was awakened by a sound. It was singing, quiet, barely audible, but unmistakably singing. A man's voice, deep and melodic, singing what sounded like a hymn or perhaps a lullaby. Samuel watched as a figure emerged from the direction of the gravedigger's cottage. The figure carried a lantern that cast a dim, flickering light. As it approached Eleanor's grave, Samuel recognized Thomas Crane. Thomas was dressed in what appeared to be his Sunday clothes, unusual attire for the middle of the night. He walked directly to Eleanor's grave and knelt beside it. He placed the lantern on the ground, and then, clearly visible in the lantern's glow, he began to speak. Samuel could not hear the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. Thomas was speaking to the grave as if someone could hear him, as if Eleanor herself might respond. He spoke for several minutes, occasionally reaching out to touch the earth, stroking it gently, almost lovingly. Then Thomas produced something from his pocket. It glinted in the lantern light, a shovel, a small gardening shovel, barely larger than a trowel. And he began to dig. Samuel Peters was frozen in shock for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he stood up and shouted, "Stop! What are you doing?" Thomas jerked upright, his face visible for just a moment in the lantern light. Samuel would later describe that face as showing no guilt, no fear, no shame, only surprise, only annoyance at being interrupted. Then Thomas grabbed his lantern and ran, disappearing into the darkness toward the swamps beyond the cemetery's edge. Samuel gave chase, but lost him within minutes in the dense vegetation. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. What do you believe Thomas Crane was really doing at that grave? Was he simply a disturbed man acting out some delusion, or had he already done something far worse? Because what was discovered in the hours and days that followed Samuel Peters' confrontation would reveal a horror so complete, so meticulously planned and executed, that it would haunt St. Augustine Parish for generations to come. At first light on April 29, 1893, Father Rouge, Constable Thatcher, Marcus Whitmore, and 6 other men from the parish gathered at Eleanor's grave. Samuel Peters had roused them all from sleep with his shocking account of the night's events. Now, standing in the pale morning light, they faced a decision that no one wanted to make. Eleanor's grave would have to be opened. There was no avoiding it. Thomas Crane's behavior had been inexplicable, deeply disturbing, but what if he had done more than simply speak to the dead? What if he had already violated the grave before Samuel had discovered him? Marcus Whitmore was initially opposed to exhumation. The thought of disturbing his daughter's rest was unbearable. But Father Rouge persuaded him that certainty, however painful, was better than the torment of not knowing. They had to know if Eleanor's body remained undisturbed. The decision was made to proceed immediately, before word could spread through the parish and turn the exhumation into a spectacle. The men sent for proper equipment and began the grim work of uncovering Eleanor's coffin. It took nearly 4 hours to reach the casket. The work was slow, respectful, each shovelful of earth removed carefully. As they dug deeper, the men became increasingly silent, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on them. Finally, around 10 o'clock that morning, they struck wood. The coffin was exposed. It was a fine casket, mahogany with brass fittings, one of the most expensive items Marcus had ever purchased, and it was immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. The coffin's lid was no longer properly secured. Several of the brass screws had been removed entirely. Others were loosened but not removed, as if whoever had tampered with them had been interrupted before completing their work. The wood showed fresh scratches and gouges, evidence of tools being used roughly, desperately. Marcus Whitmore let out a sound that witnesses would later describe as inhuman, a wail of grief and rage combined. Father Rouge gripped his shoulder, both to comfort and restrain him. Constable Thatcher ordered the men to carefully remove the coffin's lid. What they found inside would be documented in official reports, testified to in legal proceedings, and whispered about in horrified tones for decades to come. Eleanor's body was still present, but it had been disturbed, profoundly disturbed. Her dress had been rearranged, some buttons unfastened. Her hair, which had been carefully arranged for the funeral, was disheveled. Her hands, which had been folded on her chest, were now positioned differently. Most disturbing of all, there was evidence of recent intrusion. The interior lining of the coffin showed fresh damage, and the body's position suggested it had been moved, manipulated, violated in ways that no one wanted to articulate, but everyone understood. Several of the men turned away, sickened. Marcus Whitmore collapsed to his knees. Father Rouge began to pray, his voice shaking. Constable Thatcher, his face grey with shock and anger, immediately ordered that Thomas Crane be found and arrested. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. When men searched his cottage at the cemetery's edge, they discovered his door standing open, his few possessions scattered as if he had left in haste. He had fled into the swamps, taking nothing with him except perhaps some clothes and whatever money he possessed. The parish organized a search party immediately. 15 men armed with rifles and dogs combed the swamps surrounding St. Augustine, but the terrain was vast and treacherous. The cypress swamp stretched for miles in every direction, filled with deep water, hidden sinkholes, and dangerous wildlife. A man who knew the swamps could disappear into them and remain hidden indefinitely. The search continued for 3 days without success. On the evening of the 3rd day, Constable Thatcher made the decision to search Thomas Crane's cottage more thoroughly, hoping to find some clue to his whereabouts or motivations. What they discovered there would transform this case from a grave desecration into something far more disturbing, far more incomprehensible. Thomas Crane's cottage was a modest structure, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, with a single main room and a small loft accessible by a wooden ladder. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable, exactly what one would expect for a cemetery caretaker's dwelling. But inside, the cottage revealed a very different story. The main room was furnished simply, but with unexpected care. A narrow bed, meticulously made with clean linens, a small table with 1 chair, a wood stove for cooking and heating, several books on a shelf, mostly religious texts but also poetry, including a worn copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, a lantern, a few dishes. Everything was clean, organized, normal. But Father Rouge noticed something odd about the room's dimensions. The interior space seemed slightly smaller than the exterior structure would suggest. The back wall, he realized, did not quite match up with where the cottage's rear wall should be. Constable Thatcher began examining the walls more carefully. He discovered, concealed behind a carefully constructed panel of wood that matched the wall's planking, a narrow door. The door was locked, but the lock was simple, easily forced with a pry bar. Behind the door was a staircase descending into darkness. A cellar, though unusual for Louisiana, where high water tables made basements rare. Thomas had apparently excavated this space himself, reinforcing it against collapse and water intrusion. Constable Thatcher lit a lantern and descended the stairs, followed by Father Rouge and 2 Other men. What they found in that cellar would be described in official documents, but would remain largely hidden from public knowledge, considered too disturbing for general circulation. The cellar was approximately 12 feet square, its walls lined with rough wooden planks to prevent collapse. The floor was packed earth, kept remarkably dry by what appeared to be a drainage system Thomas had constructed, and the cellar had been furnished. Furnished as a bedroom, a bridal chamber. Against one wall stood a bed, larger and finer than the one upstairs. It had an ornate iron frame, clearly expensive, and was dressed with white linens that appeared new, embroidered with delicate lace. Beside the bed stood a small table with a porcelain wash basin and pitcher decorated with painted roses. On the opposite wall hung a mirror in an elaborate gilt frame. Candles in silver holders were positioned around the room, unlit but ready. And everywhere, there were photographs and drawings of Eleanor Whitmore. Some were sketches, clearly drawn by Thomas himself, showing considerable artistic skill. They depicted Eleanor in various poses, some copied from her funeral, others seemingly imagined. The drawings showed Eleanor in different dresses with different hairstyles, in different settings, but always the same subject, always Eleanor. The photographs were more disturbing. Several were copies of the funeral photographs taken of Eleanor in her coffin, standard practice for the era, but here displayed with unsettling prominence. Others appeared to have been taken secretly while Eleanor was alive, images captured from a distance showing her leaving church, working in her father's store, walking through the parish. Thomas had been watching her. For how long, no one could say, but clearly for months, perhaps years. He had been observing her, documenting her, collecting her image with obsessive thoroughness. But the most disturbing discovery was found in a trunk beneath the bed. Inside were items of women's clothing, a dress, undergarments, stockings, a nightgown, all in Eleanor's size, all new, all carefully folded and preserved, and with them wrapped in cloth several items that appeared to have been stolen from Eleanor's home or grave. A hairbrush with strands of dark hair still tangled in its bristles, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, a small Bible with her name inscribed inside. Father Rouge found a journal, a leather-bound book filled with Thomas's handwriting. The entries dated back over 2 years, to shortly after Eleanor had begun teaching Sunday school. The early entries described Thomas's first observations of her, his growing fascination, his belief that she was different from other women, purer, more beautiful, untouched by the corruption of the world. As the entries progressed, they became increasingly disturbed. Thomas wrote about his conviction that Eleanor had been placed in his life for a reason, that God intended them to be together. He described elaborate fantasies of their life together, conversations he imagined having with her, children he envisioned they would raise. He wrote poems to her, love letters he never sent, prayers asking God to help Eleanor see what was meant to be. Then came Eleanor's illness. The entries from this period were frantic, desperate. Thomas wrote about visiting the Whitmore house in secret, standing outside her window at night, listening to her fevered cries. He prayed for her recovery, but also, disturbingly, wrote about his fear that if she recovered, she might marry someone else, that death might be preferable to seeing her with another man. When Eleanor died, the journal entries changed dramatically. Rather than grief, Thomas expressed something closer to relief, even joy. He wrote that death had purified her, made her perfect, removed her from a world that would have corrupted her. He wrote that now they could be together forever, that no one could come between them, that she belonged to him alone. The final entries, written in the days before Samuel Peters discovered him at the grave, detailed Thomas's plans. He had been preparing for weeks, excavating the cellar, furnishing the room, purchasing the clothes and items she would need. He had been waiting for the right moment when the initial surge of visitors to her grave would diminish, when he could complete his work unobserved. He had intended to bring Eleanor home, to his cottage, to the room he had prepared, to the life he had imagined for them. The men standing in that cellar understood with sickening clarity what Thomas Crane had planned, what he had already partially accomplished, and what he still intended to do if he remained free. The discovery in Thomas Crane's cottage transformed the search for him from a local matter into something larger. Constable Thatcher immediately sent word to the Louisiana State Police requesting assistance. Within 2 days, additional officers arrived along with experienced trackers familiar with the vast swamp regions of southern Louisiana. The search intensified. Over 40 men participated, organized into teams that methodically explored the waterways and islands of the surrounding swamps. They found occasional traces, a campsite that might have been recently used, footprints in mud near a water source, but nothing definitive. Meanwhile, the parish was in turmoil. News of what had been found in the cellar spread despite attempts to contain it. The details were whispered in horrified tones. Women refused to visit the cemetery. Men organized armed patrols to guard not just Eleanor's grave, but the entire burial ground. Father Rouge held special masses, praying for the parish's protection and for Eleanor's soul. Marcus Whitmore had his daughter's body moved immediately. Eleanor was reburied in a new location, the exact site kept secret and known only to Father Rouge and Constable Thatcher. The original grave was filled in and left unmarked. Marcus also arranged for Eleanor's coffin to be sealed in a concrete vault, making future violation physically impossible. But Thomas Crane remained at large. As days turned into weeks, the official search was gradually scaled back. The Louisiana State Police withdrew, leaving the matter in local hands. The general consensus was that Thomas had either fled Louisiana entirely or, more likely, had died in the swamps, victim of exposure, wild animals, or drowning. But there were sightings. Throughout May and June of 1893, multiple residents reported seeing a figure in the swamps, always at a distance, always disappearing before anyone could approach. A fisherman claimed to have seen a man living in a crude shelter on one of the swamp islands. A hunter reported finding a recently abandoned campsite with evidence of long-term occupation. Most disturbing was the report from Marie Doucet, a Creole woman who lived on the swamp's edge and supported herself through fishing and herb gathering. Marie, who was regarded by some as having mystical knowledge, claimed that she had encountered Thomas Crane in early June. She said he had appeared at her shack one evening, asking for food and fresh water. She had given him what he requested, too frightened to refuse. Marie described Thomas as gaunt and wild-looking, his clothes torn and mud-stained, his face covered with a rough beard. But what disturbed her most, she said, was that he seemed completely calm, even content. He thanked her for the food and told her not to worry, that he would soon be leaving the area. Then he said something that Marie found incomprehensible but deeply unsettling. He told her that he was going to a place where they could be together, where no one would disturb them anymore. He said that love was stronger than death, stronger than law, stronger than the judgment of small-minded people who couldn't understand. He said that Eleanor was waiting for him, that he could feel her presence, calling him deeper into the swamps, to a place where the living and dead existed together. Then he disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Marie shaking and confused. When she reported this encounter to Constable Thatcher several days later, he organized another search of the area where Marie lived, but once again, they found nothing. As summer progressed and no further sightings were reported, the parish gradually returned to an uneasy normalcy. Thomas Crane became a cautionary tale, a horror story told to warn about the dangers of isolation and obsession. The cemetery remained avoided by most residents, who now associated it with evil rather than peaceful rest. Eleanor's family left St. Augustine parish entirely. Marcus sold his store and moved with his son to Texas, unable to remain in a place so saturated with tragedy. The cottage where Thomas had lived was torn down by order of Father Rouge, who personally supervised its destruction and blessed the ground where it had stood. By autumn of 1893, the official position was that Thomas Crane was dead, most likely drowned in the swamps or killed by exposure or wildlife. Constable Thatcher filed a report to that effect with state authorities. An investigation was closed. The case was considered resolved, if not solved. But in the years that followed, stories began to circulate. Stories that suggested Thomas Crane had not died. Stories that suggested he was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Louisiana swamps, living a life that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. And at the center of these stories was always the same disturbing question: was he alone out there, or had he somehow succeeded in his terrible purpose? Had he found a way to be with Eleanor, even beyond death? The answers to these questions would emerge slowly, gradually, through decades of scattered testimonies, chance discoveries, and encounters that defied rational explanation. The Thomas Crane case might have remained a local horror story, gradually fading into obscurity, if not for what happened 17 years later, in 1910. A young surveyor named William Hammond was hired by the Louisiana state government to map previously uncharted sections of the swampland south of St. Augustine Parish. The work was part of a larger effort to identify potential areas for drainage and agricultural development. Hammond, 26 years old and recently graduated from Tulane University, approached the assignment with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to prove himself in his new profession. On October 14, 1910, Hammond and his assistant, a local guide named Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, were surveying a remote section of swamp approximately 8 miles southeast of St. Augustine Parish when they discovered something unexpected on a small island of solid ground surrounded by black water. It was a structure, not a natural formation, but something built by human hands, a shelter constructed from cypress wood, palm fronds and mud, built against the base of an enormous live oak tree. The structure was weathered but intact, clearly occupied for years, perhaps decades. Hammond and Thibodeau approached cautiously. The shelter appeared abandoned, but there were signs of recent human presence: ashes in a fire pit, fish bones, fragments of cloth hanging from tree branches. Thibodeau, who had lived his entire life in the swamps and knew every camp and shelter used by trappers and fishermen, swore he had never seen this structure before, never heard of anyone living this deep in the uninhabited wetlands. Inside the shelter, they made a discovery that would eventually connect this remote dwelling to Thomas Crane and the events of 1893. They found a wooden box, roughly constructed but sealed carefully with pine tar to protect its contents from moisture. Inside were several items: a rusted tin cup, a hunting knife, fish hooks, and most significantly, a leather journal, water damaged but partially readable. Hammond initially paid little attention to the journal, but that evening, while reviewing his notes in his camp, he began examining it more closely. The handwriting was difficult to decipher, faded and water-stained, but certain passages were legible, and what he read disturbed him enough to report it to authorities in St. Augustine Parish. The journal entries were dated sporadically over many years, from 1893 to 1908. The handwriting matched samples from Thomas Crane's journal, found in his cottage 17 years earlier. Thomas had survived. He had been living in the swamps all this time, but the content of the journal was even more disturbing than the fact of his survival. The entries described a life lived in complete isolation, subsisting on fish, turtles, wild birds, and plants. Thomas wrote about building his shelter, about learning to navigate the swamps, about avoiding all human contact. But interspersed with these practical details were passages that suggested profound mental deterioration. He wrote about conversations with Eleanor, describing them as if she were physically present. He detailed their daily routines together, meals shared, nights spent beside each other, walks through the swamp at dawn. He wrote love letters to her, poems celebrating their union, prayers of gratitude for their life together, away from the judgment of the world. One particularly chilling passage, dated April 1897, described Thomas's contentment. 4 years we have lived here, my Eleanor and I, in perfect happiness. She never ages, never changes, remains forever as she was in her 19th year. The swamp protects us, the water purifies us. We exist outside of time, outside of death, outside of the laws that bind lesser souls. Another entry from September 1903 read, "Today I wove flowers into her hair, magnolias and water lilies, the blooms she loved most in life. She smiled at me, my bride, my eternal companion. The world believes us separated, believes that death created a barrier between us. They cannot comprehend that love is stronger, that devotion transcends all boundaries." The journal's final entry was dated March 1908, 2 years before its discovery. It was brief and seemed hurried. "The water rises. We must move deeper. They are coming closer. I hear voices in the night, searching, always searching, but they will never find us. Eleanor and I will go where no one dares follow, into the heart of the swamp, into the place where land and water meet, where the living and dead walk together. We will be safe there, forever safe." The discovery of the journal prompted a new search of the area where Hammond had found the shelter. Louisiana State Police, accompanied by experienced swamp guides, conducted a thorough investigation of the island and surrounding waters. They found evidence of long-term habitation. Fire pits at various locations, primitive tools, fishing equipment, and, disturbingly, what appeared to be a second structure, smaller and more carefully constructed, set deeper in the island's interior. This second structure was partially collapsed, its roof caved in, its walls sagging with decay. Inside, investigators found what appeared to be a bed frame constructed from cypress branches, now mostly rotted, and scattered among the debris were fragments of cloth, white fabric that might once have been a dress or burial shroud, now stained and deteriorated beyond recognition. They also found bones, small bones, consistent with a human hand. They were examined by the parish doctor, who confirmed they were human remains, though he could not determine how long they had been there or provide any other definitive information about them. The remains were collected and eventually buried in an unmarked grave in St. Augustine Parish Cemetery. DNA testing did not exist in 1910, so there was no way to confirm whether these bones belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. But the official report stated that it was highly probable, given the context of the discovery. The case seemed to be approaching resolution. The general assumption was that Thomas Crane had died sometime after 1908, possibly during one of the severe storms that periodically devastated the Louisiana coast, and that whatever remained of Eleanor Whitmore's body had finally been laid to rest properly. But then came the testimony of Baptiste Arsenault. Baptiste was a trapper who worked the swamps south of St. Augustine Parish, one of the few men who regularly ventured into the deepest, most remote sections of the wetlands. In December 1910, 2 months after Hammond's discovery, Baptiste reported an encounter that he swore was true, though he understood few would believe him. He claimed that on the evening of December 8th, while checking his trap lines near dusk, he had seen a figure moving through the water in the distance. The figure appeared to be a man, tall and heavily built, wading through waist-deep water while carrying something wrapped in white cloth. Baptiste watched from concealment, not wanting to announce his presence to a stranger in such a remote location. The figure moved slowly, almost ceremonially, through the water toward a small island covered in dense vegetation. As the figure climbed onto the island, Baptiste caught a clearer view. The man had long grey hair and a full beard. He wore remnants of clothes that were little more than rags, and the bundle he carried, Baptiste swore, was approximately the size and shape of a human body. The man disappeared into the vegetation. Baptiste waited for nearly an hour, but the man did not reappear. When full darkness fell, Baptiste saw a faint glow from the island's interior, as if someone had lit a candle or small fire. And then he heard something that made him leave immediately, abandoning his trap lines and paddling his pirogue back towards civilization as fast as he could manage. He heard singing, a man's voice, deep and surprisingly melodic, singing what sounded like a hymn or wedding song. And beneath the singing, Baptiste claimed he heard something else, a music box playing a delicate, tinkling melody that drifted across the dark water. Baptiste reported this encounter to Father Rouge, who by 1910 was an elderly man, still serving St. Augustine parish, but increasingly frail. The priest listened to Baptiste's story with grave concern, but did not report it to civil authorities. Instead, he documented it in the parish records, adding his own observation. If Baptiste speaks truly, then Thomas Crane lives still and continues his terrible devotion. May God have mercy on his tortured soul, and may Eleanor Whitmore finally find the peace she was denied in death. In the years that followed, there were occasional reports from trappers, fishermen, and hunters who worked the deep swamps. Stories of a wild man seen at great distances, always carrying something, always moving deeper into the wilderness. Stories of finding small shrines in remote locations, decorated with flowers and crude crosses made from cypress branches. Stories of hearing singing in the night, hymns and love songs echoing across dark water. In 1923, a Creole woman named Celestine Broussard reported finding a small wooden cross on an island she visited regularly to gather medicinal plants. The cross had been recently placed there, she said, and at its base were fresh magnolia blossoms arranged in the shape of a heart. Carved into the cross's surface were two sets of initials, TC and EW, and a date, March 23, 1893, the day of Eleanor Whitmore's original burial. In 1934, during the Great Depression, when desperate men sometimes ventured deep into the swamp seeking anything of value, two treasure hunters claimed they discovered a crude cemetery on a remote island. They described finding several graves marked with crosses and stones, but one grave in particular caught their attention. It was more carefully maintained than the others, its cross more elaborate, decorated with shells and colored stones arranged in intricate patterns. The grave was covered with fresh earth and surrounded by flowers that impossibly appeared recently planted and tended. The men tried to excavate the grave, hoping to find valuables that might have been buried with the deceased. But as they began digging, they heard something moving in the vegetation surrounding the small clearing. They claimed a figure emerged from the jungle, a skeletal old man with wild white hair and beard, dressed in rags, but still powerfully built despite his advanced age. The man said nothing, only stood watching them with eyes that one of the treasure hunters described as not quite human anymore, like looking at something that should have died long ago, but refused to. The men fled, abandoning their tools and their small boat in their panic. They never returned to that location and refused to guide anyone else there, though several people attempted to hire them. These stories might all be dismissed as superstition, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. The swamps were notorious for inspiring fear and strange tales, But the cumulative weight of these reports, spanning decades and coming from multiple independent witnesses, suggested something genuinely anomalous was occurring in the remote wetlands south of St. Augustine Parish. The last documented report of anything related to Thomas Crane came in 1954, 61 years after Eleanor, Whitmore's death. A team of wildlife biologists studying bird populations in the swamps discovered, on an island they believed had never been visited by humans, a structure that had clearly been inhabited for an extended period but was now abandoned. Inside the structure, they found human remains, a skeleton, that of a large adult male, lying on what appeared to have been a bed constructed from vegetation and wood. The skeleton's arms were positioned as if embracing something, but there was nothing there, only empty space where the arms curved inward. Beside the skeleton was a rusted metal box. Inside were two items, a faded photograph of a young woman in Victorian dress and a wedding ring, gold with a small diamond, engraved with the initials EW. The remains and artifacts were collected and eventually turned over to Louisiana state authorities. The skeleton was examined, determined to be that of a male between 60 and 70 years old at time of death. Cause of death could not be determined. The remains were eventually buried in an unmarked grave in St. Augustine Parish Cemetery, though no one could definitively prove they belonged to Thomas Crane. The wedding ring was identified through historical records as having been purchased by Marcus Whitmore in 1892, intended as a future gift for his daughter Eleanor when she eventually married. The ring had been stored in the Whitmore home and was never reported stolen, but Marcus Whitmore had left Louisiana in 1893 and had died in Texas in 1920, so there was no way to confirm how Thomas Crane might have obtained it. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in those swamps between 1893 and 1954. Whether Thomas Crane truly survived for decades in complete isolation, whether he succeeded in his terrible purpose of keeping Eleanor's body with him, whether the stories told by trappers and hunters were real encounters or products of superstition and fear, these questions remain unanswered. The story of Thomas Crane and Eleanor Whitmore has become one of the most disturbing legends in Louisiana folklore, a tale that blurs the boundary between documented history and dark mythology. The verifiable facts are these. Eleanor Whitmore died of yellow fever on March 23, 1893, and was buried in St. Augustine Parish Cemetery. Thomas Crane, the cemetery's gravedigger, developed an obsessive fixation on Eleanor that crossed from admiration into something far more disturbing. He violated her grave, disturbed her body, and prepared an underground chamber where he intended to bring her corpse to live with him as his bride. When discovered, he fled into the swamps and was never officially captured or confirmed dead. Beyond these facts, everything becomes murky, dependent on testimonies that cannot be verified, discoveries that raise more questions than they answer, and stories that grow increasingly strange with each retelling. So what really happened? There are several theories, each with its adherents and its skeptics. The first theory, and the one accepted by most historians, is that Thomas Crane died in the swamps within weeks or months of his flight in April 1893. The swamps were dangerous, filled with alligators, water moccasins, and disease-carrying mosquitoes. A man alone, without proper supplies or knowledge of swamp survival, would have struggled to survive even a few weeks. The journal found in 1910, according to this theory, was either a forgery created by someone for unknown reasons, or genuine but written by Thomas shortly before his death, with the dated entries being either backdated or misread due to water damage. The later sightings were either cases of mistaken identity, other swamp dwellers glimpsed at a distance, or complete fabrications, The second theory suggests that Thomas Crane did survive in the swamps for an extended period, perhaps several years, living as a hermit and subsisting on what the wilderness provided. According to this theory, he suffered from severe mental illness, probably schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder that manifested in his obsessive behavior toward Eleanor. His journal entries describing life with Eleanor were delusions, products of his deteriorating mental state. He likely died sometime in the early 1900s, possibly during one of the hurricanes that struck the Louisiana coast during that period. The later sightings were either unrelated swamp dwellers or simply legends that grew from the original story. The third theory, whispered but rarely stated openly, is that Thomas Crane succeeded in his terrible purpose. That he did indeed retrieve Eleanor's body from her grave before being discovered, or that he returned later and successfully exhumed her remains. That he kept her body with him in the swamps, treating her corpse as if she were alive, creating a horrifying parody of domestic life in the wilderness. According to this theory, Thomas survived for decades through a combination of luck, swamp knowledge he acquired, and perhaps a kind of madness that paradoxically kept him functional in ways a sane person could not have managed. He finally died in the 1940s or 1950s, still clinging to Eleanor's remains until the very end. Each theory has elements that are disturbing in different ways. The first suggests that a profound violation occurred but was limited in scope and duration. The second suggests a tragedy of mental illness, a man whose mind betrayed him into increasingly delusional states. The third suggests something almost incomprehensible, a devotion so absolute that it transcended sanity, legality, and even the basic recognition of death itself. What we do know for certain is that something happened in the swamps south of St. Augustine Parish that left echoes extending far beyond the original events of 1893. Whether those echoes were supernatural, psychological, or simply the product of human imagination confronting something it couldn't fully process, we cannot say with absolute certainty. St. Augustine Parish still exists, though it's much changed from its 1893 incarnation. The old cemetery remains, though it's no longer actively used. The location of Eleanor Whitmore's original grave has been forgotten, deliberately erased from memory. The cottage where Thomas Crane lived was destroyed, as mentioned, but locals claim the ground where it stood remains cursed, that grass won't grow there, that animals avoid the spot. The swamps where Thomas fled remain vast, largely unexplored, dangerous to those unfamiliar with their ways. Even today, with modern equipment and GPS technology, there are sections that remain unmapped, islands that appear and disappear with changing water levels, areas where few people venture and fewer return with coherent accounts of what they saw. And sometimes, though rarely, reports still emerge. A hunter who heard singing in an uninhabited section of swamp, a fisherman who found a small shrine decorated with flowers, a biologist who discovered what appeared to be a grave, carefully maintained in a location no human should have been able to reach or survive in. These reports are always investigated, they are always found to be inconclusive. And life continues, as it always does, around the edges of mysteries we cannot solve. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what Thomas Crane did in those swamps, or how long he survived there, or what finally became of Eleanor Whitmore's body. The case remains open in the most technical sense, though no active investigation continues. Some mysteries, it seems, are not meant to be solved. Some horrors are too profound to be fully understood, and some love, if it can still be called love, when twisted beyond all recognition, refuses to acknowledge even death as a boundary. This was the story of the Gravedigger's bride, the love that was buried alive, and the question that still haunts the swamps of Louisiana. when devotion becomes obsession, when love becomes violation, when a man refuses to accept that death means ending, where does humanity end and something else begin? I leave that question for you to ponder. Share your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you believe really happened in those swamps. Was Thomas Crane a monster, a madman, or something else entirely? Did he die alone in the wilderness, or did he somehow achieve the terrible union he sought? Thank you for joining me on this dark journey into one of Louisiana's most disturbing historical mysteries. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the shadows of history. Share this video with others who appreciate the darker corners of the American past. And join our haunted community in the comments, where we continue these conversations and explore the questions that history leaves unanswered. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly dead. It's not even past. It lives on in the stories we tell, the mysteries we preserve, and the shadows that refuse to disappear, no matter how much light we shine upon them. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most of all, stay aware that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again.